put the company in my son's name and fend for yourself." I just smiled back. But when my lawyer walked into the room and read the DNA test out loud, her perfect little world completely shattered. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed her, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that greed always comes with a heavy price. Your support means everything to this old man. The smell of white lilies and expensive floor wax was absolutely suffocating. We were standing in the grand foyer of my estate in Boston, the massive stone and glass house Catherine and I had built from the ground up over 40 years of marriage. It was the late afternoon of her funeral. The enormous crystal chandelier above us cast a cold, sharp light over the dozens of guests dressed in somber black, all murmuring their hollow condolences. I am William Stanford, 70 years old, and at that moment I felt completely hollowed out. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that suddenly felt 2 sizes too big for my shrinking frame. I had spent the last 3 days moving like an absolute ghost through my own life. Catherine was gone. The only woman who ever truly understood the man behind the CEO title of Stanford Developments was resting in the cold ground. I desperately needed a moment to breathe. The endless handshakes, the pitying looks from corporate partners, the fake tears from distant relatives looking for a handout. It was all becoming unbearable. I nodded politely to a group of investors and slipped away from the crowded living room. I retreated into the darkened, quiet hallway leading to my private study. The heavy oak doors and thick Persian rugs muffled the chatter of the wake. I just wanted 5 minutes of absolute silence. 5 minutes to close my eyes, lean against the wall, and pretend that Catherine was still upstairs reading her favorite novels by the bay window, like she had done every Sunday for decades. But as I approached the half-open door of my study, I heard voices, familiar, hushed voices. It was my daughter-in-law, Victoria, and my son, Preston. They had apparently slipped away from the guests as well to find a private corner. I paused in the shadows, about to push the door open and ask them to leave so I could have some privacy. But Victoria's words stopped me dead in my tracks. "Can you actually believe he spent $30,000 on that casket?" Victoria scoffed. Her voice was completely stripped of the sweet, gentle mourning tone she had been using in front of the guests all afternoon. "It is solid mahogany, Preston? $30,000 just to be buried in the dirt. Do you know what we could have done with that money? The return on investment we could have gotten if he had just given it to us. It is completely irresponsible and ridiculous." I stood frozen in this dark hallway, my hand hovering inches from the brass doorknob. My wife, the woman who had welcomed Victoria into this family with open arms, the woman who had bought her endless gifts and defended her every flaw, had just been laid to rest hours ago. And my daughter-in-law was standing inside my own home complaining about the cost of her final resting place. I felt a cold, hard knot tighten in the pit of my stomach. I waited for my son, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had raised and mentored, to defend his mother. I waited for him to demand respect. Instead, I heard Preston sigh. It was a weak, pathetic sound. "I know, Victoria," he mumbled softly. But Dad was highly emotional. You know how he gets when he is stressed. He wasn't thinking straight. He just wanted the absolute best for Mom. "He is not thinking straight at all!" Victoria snapped her heels, clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor as she paced around my desk. "And that is exactly my point, Preston. Look at him out there today. He is an absolute mess. He is weak. He looks like a stiff breeze could knock him over. Now that the old woman is gone, we need to take control of the situation before he starts liquidating assets out of pure grief. He is sitting on a massive real estate empire, and he is acting like a lost child." I pressed my back flat against the cold plaster wall, holding my breath. The heavy grief that had been crushing my chest for days suddenly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by an icy, calculated clarity. The corporate wolf that had built Stanford Developments from a single rented office space into a multi-million-dollar empire slowly woke up. I closed my eyes and listened to the poison spilling from her mouth. "You need to step up right now, Preston." Victoria continued, her voice dropping into a sharp, commanding whisper. You are the chief operating officer. You are the only heir. Next month we need to bring up Silver Pines. Silver Pines. Preston asked, his voice trembling slightly. Victoria. That is a nursing home. An assisted living facility. You cannot be serious right now. Dad is only 70 years old. He still runs the board of directors. He is sharp. He is not going to just agree to be locked away in a medical facility. He will, if we play it right, Victoria hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Silver Pines is a luxury facility. We do not call it a nursing home. We spin it as an exclusive health retreat. We tell him his blood pressure is a massive concern. We tell him the immense stress of running the company without Catherine by his side is going to kill him. We pay off his private doctors to get them on board. We wear his mind down every single day. Once he is safely locked in there, we get him to sign over the controlling shares of the company to you and little Leo. The old man is clueless, Preston. He trusts us blindly. If we push hard enough and play the concerned family card, he will hand over the keys to the kingdom just to have some peace and quiet. But his lawyer Preston stammered, sounding utterly terrified of his own wife. Bradley Lawson is an absolute shark. He has handled Dad's corporate and private accounts for 30 years. Bradley will never let him sign over the trust without a massive legal fight. He will ask too many questions. Let me worry about Bradley Lawson, Victoria said dismissively. I have Leo. This entire family revolves around my son. Your father worships the ground that boy walks on. He will do anything to secure his only grandson's future. The entire Stanford legacy is going to fall right into our laps by the end of the year. You just have to stop being so spineless and do exactly what I tell you to do. I kept my eyes closed in the dark. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. This woman lived in a $2 million house in the suburbs that I had paid for in cash. Her designer clothes and luxury vacations were bought entirely with my money. Her whole existence was funded by my hard work. And here she was standing in my sanctuary planning to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me away. And my son, the boy I had groomed to be a strong leader, was standing there letting her orchestrate my demise without a single fight. My hands curled into tight fists. My knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body screamed for immediate confrontation. I wanted to storm into that room. I wanted to scream at them, to physically throw them out of my house in front of all the guests. I wanted to strip Preston of his executive title right then and there. But 30 years in ruthless corporate warfare had taught me one absolute truth. You never strike when you are angry. You strike when you are fully prepared. If I burst in there right now, Victoria would instantly play the victim. She would turn on the tears. She would claim she was just heavily stressed, that she was speaking out of grief, that I was misunderstanding her intentions. She would cover her tracks and hide her assets. No. I was not going to give her that chance. I was going to let her believe her perfect lie. I was going to let her think I was a clueless, broken, grieving old man. I would play their game until I had all the leverage to destroy them completely. I slowly began to back away from the door, intending to return to the main reception and play the role of the frail widower they expected me to be. I took one careful step backward into the deep shadows of the hallway. And then my leather dress shoe came down on the very edge of an old, loose floorboard. A loud, sharp creak echoed through the silent, dimly lit hallway. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. The hushed voices inside the study stopped instantly. Dead, terrifying silence fell over the room. "Who is out there?" Victoria demanded sharply, her voice suddenly high and intensely nervous. I froze entirely, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I heard the quick, sharp tapping of her expensive heels, moving rapidly toward the doorway. The heavy wooden door swung open wider, spilling a long, bright beam of yellow light directly into the dark hallway. Victoria stepped out, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as they tried to pierce through the shadows where I stood. Preston appeared right behind her shoulder, looking pale, guilty, and utterly terrified. I stood completely still in the dark, barely breathing, watching my daughter-in-law stare directly toward where I was hiding. The fake, sorrowful, loving smile she had worn in front of the guests all day was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, and vicious glare. Did she see me? Did she know I had heard every single word of her filthy, greedy plan? For 3 agonizing seconds, the heavy silence of the hallway pressed down on my chest. Victoria's piercing gaze swept through the dim light, sweeping right over the shadow where I stood. Then the antique grandfather clock in the grand foyer began to chime, breaking the tension. I let out a long, shuddering breath and purposely stepped forward into the edge of the light. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my back, to strip away my usual imposing posture. I made my hands tremble slightly, rubbing my temples as if the sheer weight of the funeral had completely disoriented my mind. The instant the hallway light hit my face, Victoria's expression shifted completely. It was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. The cold, calculating glare melted away instantly, replaced by the soft, overly concerned smile she had perfected for the country club crowd. Preston exhaled audibly behind her, practically sagging against the wooden doorframe in pure relief. "William." Victoria gasped softly, rushing forward to wrap a warm hand around my arm. "You startled us. We were just coming to look for you. You should not be wandering around in the dark by yourself today." I looked at her, fighting every single instinct that told me to tear my arm away from her toxic grip. "I just wanted some quiet," I mumbled, keeping my voice frail and exhausted. "The crowd out there is just too much right now." "We know," Dad Preston chimed in, suddenly finding his courage now that the perceived danger had passed. He stepped out of the study, confidently adjusting his expensive silk tie. "We were actually just talking about you, about your health." Victoria guided me gently toward the kitchen, her grip tight, almost steering me like a fragile child. "I was just telling Preston that we need to look into a luxury health retreat for you," she cooed, guiding me to a bar stool and pouring hot water into a delicate porcelain teacup. "Your blood pressure has been so terribly high these last few months with Catherine's illness. We were looking at a beautiful place called Silver Pines. It has round-the-clock nurses and beautiful private gardens. You would not have to worry about a single thing. Preston can handle the developments while you finally get some real rest." Silver Pines. A luxury health retreat. The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly, so flawlessly coated in a thick layer of fake compassion. I took the teacup from her hands, feeling the heat seep into my cold fingers. I looked down at the dark amber liquid, thinking about my beautiful Catherine. My late wife had spent the last 5 years defending this woman. Whenever I pointed out Victoria's reckless spending or her sharp, condescending tone, Catherine would always place a gentle hand on my cheek and tell me to be patient. She would say that Preston had finally found someone who made him happy, that Victoria just needed time to adjust to our family's wealthy lifestyle. To honor Catherine, I had tolerated the exorbitant credit card bills, the endless luxury vacations, the blatant disrespect disguised as modern independence. But Catherine was gone now, and the protective shield covering Victoria had vanished with her. "A health retreat," I repeated slowly, letting my voice waver just enough to sound overwhelmed by the suggestion. "You think I need to go away? Just for a little while," Dad Preston said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You built this company from nothing. You gave us everything. But you are grieving. You are not in the right state of mind to deal with shareholder meetings and zoning permits right now. We just want to protect you." I looked up at my son, the chief operating officer of a $40 million real estate empire, a title I had practically handed to him on a silver platter. He could not even look me directly in the eye. He was staring intently at the marble countertop. I took a slow sip of the hot tea. I let my posture sink even further, embracing the role of the broken, clueless old man they so desperately needed me to be. "Maybe you are right, Preston," I whispered softly, staring blankly at the wall. "I am just so incredibly tired. I cannot seem to think straight today. Let me get through the week. Then we can talk about this retreat." Victoria's eyes sparkled. It was a brief, greedy flash of pure triumph that she could not entirely hide. "Take all the time you need, William," she purred, patting my hand gently. "We are family. We take care of our own." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of hollow interactions. The guests eventually filtered out, leaving the massive Boston estate feeling emptier than it ever had before. The catering staff packed up their silver trays and vanished into the night. Preston and Victoria announced they were heading upstairs to put little Leo to bed in the guest wing. They offered to hire a cleaning crew for the study, but I waved them off, insisting that keeping my hands busy would help me process the grief. They did not argue. They were far too eager to celebrate their perceived victory behind closed doors. Alone again, I walked back into my private study. The air in the room still felt tainted by their greedy conversation. I moved behind my massive mahogany desk, the very place where I had signed the contracts that secured their entire future. I began gathering the scattered sympathy cards and empty glasses left behind by the guests. My mind was racing rapidly, calculating every single asset, every trust fund clause, every piece of leverage I held over them. If they wanted a war, I would give them an absolute masterpiece of destruction. But I needed concrete proof of their current moves before I sprang the trap. I reached under the desk to grab the small wastebasket, intending to empty it into the main recycling bin. As I pulled it out, I noticed a strange clump of shredded paper resting at the very bottom. It was completely out of place. My cleaning staff emptied this bin every single morning, and I had not used the shredder in days. I set the basket on the desk and turned on the brass reading lamp. With careful, deliberate movements, I dumped the contents onto the smooth leather surface of the desk. Someone had rushed. They had used the old strip shredder instead of the heavy-duty cross-cut machine I normally used for sensitive documents. I sat down in my heavy leather chair, sliding on my reading glasses. My hands, which had supposedly been trembling with grief an hour ago, were now completely steady. I arranged the long, thin strips of paper like a jigsaw puzzle, sliding the jagged edges together under the warm yellow light. It took me 10 minutes to piece the document back together. When the text finally aligned, the breath caught entirely in my throat. It was not a sympathy card or a misprinted office memo. It was a banking confirmation receipt printed fresh that very morning. The header bore the logo of an elite European auto importer located downtown. The transaction was a direct wire transfer for exactly $120,000. The item listed was a custom-ordered Porsche, but it was not the exorbitant price tag that made my blood run entirely cold. It was the account the funds had been drawn from. The money had not come from Preston's personal trust fund or Victoria's generous monthly allowance. The transfer was billed directly to a corporate vendor account labeled Apex Design Consulting, a vendor approved and signed off by the Chief Operating Officer of Stanford Developments. Preston. My son had just authorized a massive 6-figure corporate payout to a phantom consulting firm, and Victoria had tried to permanently destroy the evidence right here in my own study, while simultaneously burying my wife. I stared at the reconstructed receipt, the sheer audacity of the theft burning a hole through my mind. They were not just planning to lock me away in a luxury cage to steal my legacy. They were already actively bleeding my company dry. I carefully picked up the strips of paper and slid them into a clear plastic folder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the dark room. The time for playing the grieving, harmless widower was officially over. It was time to hunt. I locked the study doors. I needed absolute privacy. The walls held too many secrets, and I was about to uncover the darkest one. The house was silent. I retrieved my encrypted laptop from the safe, setting it next to the shredded receipt. I took a deep breath and opened the screen. I logged into the financial mainframe of Stanford Developments. Preston had sent summarized reports designed to look healthy. But I was the founder. I felt the ghost of my past corporate battles guiding my hands. I bypassed the executive dashboard and dove into the raw transaction logs. My fingers typed my master credentials. The screen flooded with financial data, the lifeblood of my $40 million empire. I typed Apex Design Consulting into the vendor search bar. The Porsche receipt was the tip of a massive iceberg. Wire transfers filled the monitor. $50,000 for brand strategy. $80,000 for market analysis. $150,000 for international expansion. The payments stretched back over 8 months, escalating as my wife grew sicker. I scrolled to the bottom. They had siphoned almost $4.2 million out of our cash reserves. I clicked the authorization stamp for the largest transfer. An executive signature popped up. It belonged to the chief operating officer. Preston. My son had methodically signed away millions to a ghost company while his mother was dying. This was a calculated financial drain. I printed every ledger. By sunrise, I had a thick stack of undeniable evidence locked securely in my safe. I needed to see my son look me in the eyes and defend his theft. I walked down to the kitchen. Preston was already there, pouring a cup of dark roast coffee. He looked perfectly rested in a sharp navy suit. I shuffled into the room, keeping up the facade of the broken widower. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a glass of water. "Good morning, Dad," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Did you get any sleep?" "A few hours," I lied, sitting heavily at the island. "Preston, I was trying to distract myself last night. I glanced over some quarterly summaries you sent over to keep my mind busy." Preston stiffened slightly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You should not be worrying about work today, Dad. I have everything completely under control. You need to focus on resting." "I know," I muttered, staring blankly at the granite countertop. I noticed a vendor name I did not recognize. Apex Design Consulting. The numbers seemed quite large. What exactly do they handle for us? I watched him closely, waiting for the panic. But Preston did not hesitate. His face remained completely relaxed. He smiled patiently, like a teacher explaining a simple concept to a confused student. "Oh, Apex Design," he said smoothly. "They are an elite marketing firm based out of Europe. We brought them on to handle our upcoming overseas commercial expansions. It is a heavy initial investment, but the projected returns are massive." I felt a dangerous surge of anger rising in my chest. He was lying straight to my face. I nodded slowly. "I do not remember signing off on an international marketing firm of that scale," I replied softly. Preston leaned against the counter, crossing his arms casually, and then he crossed a line that sealed his absolute destruction. "You did not sign off on it, Dad," Preston said, lowering his voice into a tone of quiet reverence. "Mom did." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin. "What did you say?" I whispered. "Mom approved the vendor contract just a few weeks before she passed away," Preston lied flawlessly. "You were so busy managing her doctors, she did not want to burden you with the operational details. She gave Apex Design her full blessing. She wanted to ensure the company continued to grow for Leo's future. It was her final executive decision." A wave of pure nausea washed over me. He was weaponizing Catherine's memory, twisting her legacy to shield his pathetic embezzlement. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed to stop myself from grabbing his expensive silk tie. I forced a weak, trembling smile. "That sounds exactly like your mother," I whispered. "Always protecting the family." "Exactly," Preston agreed, patting my shoulder as he walked past me toward the hallway. "I will see you tonight." I stood alone in the kitchen. My son was entirely lost to me. I poured the rest of his coffee down the drain, feeling a cold resolve settling deep into my bones. I walked back toward my study, needing quiet isolation. I moved toward the massive bay window that overlooked the sprawling backyard. The morning sun was shining brightly on the green lawns. Victoria was outside. She was wearing a stunning designer dress, holding a cup of tea as she spoke on her cell phone. She was laughing, looking completely radiant, just one day after my wife was put into the ground. Suddenly, the back patio doors swung open. Little Leo, my 5-year-old grandson, came running out onto the grass. He was holding a small wooden toy boat. His face was lit up with joy as he sprinted across the lawn toward his mother. He wanted a hug. "Mommy, look!" Leo yelled happily, rushing toward Victoria with his arms wide open. Victoria did not smile. She did not open her arms to catch her running child. Instead, as Leo reached out to hug her waist, Victoria flinched violently. A look of absolute disgust flashed across her face. She shoved the boy away, swatting at his hands with a cruel, dismissive slap. "Get off me, Leo," she hissed sharply. "You have dirt on your hands. Do not touch this dress, it is pure silk. Go play with the nanny." Leo stumbled backward, clutching his little wooden boat to his chest. The joyful smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of heartbreaking rejection. He stood there on the grass, looking up at his mother with sad eyes. Victoria did not even look at him. She brushed down the fabric of her expensive dress, turned her back on her child, and went back to laughing on her phone call. I stood still behind the glass, my breath caught in my throat. I had seen many cold people in the corporate world, but the sheer repulsion in Victoria's eyes when her son tried to hug her was entirely unnatural. It was not the reaction of a strict mother. It was the reaction of a woman who despised the very touch of that child. My corporate instincts began screaming in my mind. The massive financial theft, the plot to lock me in a nursing home, the desperate urgency to transfer the company shares to a 5-year-old boy, and a mother who looked at that exact same boy with pure, unfiltered disgust. The rot in my house was not just about stolen money. It was something much deeper, far more sinister. I stared out the window, watching the little boy walk sadly back toward the house. A terrifying suspicion began to crawl up my spine. That suspicion gnawed at my thoughts relentlessly over the following days. I spent my time confined mostly to my study, quietly watching the household dynamics shift. Victoria moved through the mansion with increasing authority, issuing orders to the staff with a sharp, arrogant tone that Catherine would have never tolerated. I maintained my facade, shuffling past her in the hallways, offering vacant smiles and tired nods. I needed her to feel completely secure in her dominance. I needed her to believe that I was rapidly fading into the background of my own life, becoming nothing more than a silent ghost. It was on Thursday morning that the next piece of the puzzle fell directly into my lap. I was sitting at the kitchen table, forcing myself to eat a bowl of oatmeal, when Thomas, our private family driver of 12 years, walked in. He looked deeply uncomfortable, holding his uniform cap in his hands. He cleared his throat and told me that Victoria had just terminated his employment, effective immediately. I set my spoon down, feigning mild confusion. When I asked him why, Thomas explained that Victoria claimed the family was restructuring our household expenses to save some extra money. Restructuring expenses. The absolute gall of that woman. She was actively draining millions of dollars into a phantom corporate account. Yet she was firing a loyal employee to save a few $1,000s a month. It was a calculated move to isolate the household, to remove anyone who might report back to me. I thanked Thomas, handed him a generous severance check from my private secure account, and told him to enjoy a long vacation. Shortly after Thomas left, Victoria breezed into the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, looking incredibly pleased with her recent ruthless decision. I asked her mildly how Leo was getting to his private prep school now that Thomas was gone. She smiled that practiced artificial smile and told me not to worry about a thing. She said she had arranged for a distant cousin to help out with Leo's transportation and afternoon tutoring. A family favor, she called it. I simply nodded, thanking her for taking such initiative, while I was allegedly so overwhelmed with grief. But my corporate instincts were on high alert. You do not fire a trusted bonded family driver to rely on a distant cousin for daily help. You only make that kind of drastic change if you are hiding something that you do not want the household staff to see. That afternoon, I made sure I was sitting on the front porch with a cup of tea and a blanket draped over my knees when it was time for Leo to be picked up. The heavy wrought iron gates of the estate slowly swung open. A low, throaty rumble echoed up the long paved driveway. A brand-new, sleek, midnight blue Porsche rolled to a smooth stop right in front of the grand entrance of my home. My breath hitched in my chest. I recognized the make and model instantly. It was the exact car from the shredded banking receipt I had painstakingly reconstructed in my study. The $120,000 vehicle purchased with funds siphoned from Stanford Developments. I gripped the armrests of my wooden rocking chair, forcing my face to remain entirely passive as the driver stepped out of the vehicle. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a sharply tailored suit without a tie. He had slicked back dark hair and an arrogant, incredibly confident, and aggressive physical swagger. He instantly rubbed me the wrong way. He did not look like a humble cousin doing a family favor. He looked like a man who believed he owned the very driveway he was standing on. Victoria stepped out of the front door, pulling Leo along by the hand. When she saw the man standing by the Porsche, her entire demeanor shifted. The cold, rigid posture she maintained around me completely vanished. She practically glowed. "William," Victoria said smoothly, gesturing toward the driveway. "This is my cousin Derek. He recently moved to the city and offered his help with young Leo." I stood up slowly, making a deliberate show of using my cane to steady myself. I walked down the porch steps and extended my hand. "Nice to meet you, Derek," I said, keeping my voice raspy and weak. "It is very generous of you to help our family during this difficult time." Derek took my hand. His grip was firm, almost aggressively, so trying to assert dominance over a man he clearly believed was a decaying fossil. "Happy to help," Sir Derek replied, flashing a wide, confident smile. "Family has to stick together, especially during tough times, am I right?" I nodded, thanking him again. But as I stepped back, I observed the unspoken dynamic between the two of them. It was glaringly obvious to anyone who knew how to read human behavior. Victoria was standing just a fraction too close to him. The way Derek looked at her was not the fond, polite gaze of a distant relative. His eyes swept over her designer outfit with raw, unfiltered hunger. And when his gaze shifted from Victoria to the massive stone facade of my estate, the hunger in his eyes morphed into pure, unchecked, and incredibly greedy, possessive material ownership. He was looking at my house as if he was already planning where to put his furniture. Then Derek turned his attention to little Leo. "Hey there, buddy," Derek said, his voice dropping into a surprisingly warm, affectionate tone. "Are you ready to go look at some numbers?" Leo, who usually shrank away from strangers, instantly beamed. He dropped his mother's hand and ran straight toward Derek. Derek laughed loudly, a deep, resonant sound, and reached down easily, scooping the 5-year-old boy up into the air. Leo giggled uncontrollably, wrapping his small arms tightly around Derek's strong neck. It was a picture of perfect, unscripted domestic joy. A stark, terrifying contrast to the disgust Victoria had shown the boy just days prior. I stood frozen on the bottom step of the porch. The late afternoon sun illuminated their faces perfectly as Derek hoisted the boy onto his hip. They were both laughing at something Leo had whispered, and in that exact fleeting moment, as their faces were pressed right next to each other, the bottom dropped out of my stomach. I stopped breathing. The world around me seemed to completely fade into a muted, intensely ringing, silent void. I stared at the man and the child, my eyes locked on their features. When Leo laughed, the left corner of his mouth always hitched up slightly higher than the right. It was a distinct, endearing little quirk. A small, asymmetrical smile that we assumed was a unique family trait. But as Derek laughed, his mouth curved in the exact same way. The exact same asymmetrical, crooked smile. A wave of profound, suffocating realization crashed down over my body. Preston was not the father of this child. The boy holding the keys to my legacy was an absolute genetic stranger. I stood frozen on the bottom step of the porch, staring at the man and the boy. The exact same crooked, asymmetrical smile mirrored on their faces. The chilling realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Preston was not the father of this child. The boy paraded around as the sole heir to the Stanford legacy. The child I poured my heart into was a genetic stranger. He was the product of Victoria and this arrogant man in my driveway. The betrayal was so profound, it knocked the breath out of my lungs. My mourning for Catherine was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating state of war. I forced my face to remain neutral. I offered a frail nod to Derek and turned around, slowly shuffling back inside. Every step was a carefully acted performance of a defeated old man. I walked into the kitchen and waited in the shadows. 10 minutes later, Victoria and Leo came inside. Leo ran straight to the sink, grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and took a long drink before running off to the playroom. Victoria followed him without a backward glance. I moved quickly. I grabbed a pair of latex gloves from the pantry. I carefully picked up the glass Leo had just drank from, sealing it tightly inside a clean plastic bag. Next, I walked back out to the front porch. The evening shadows were stretching across the lawn. I walked down the path toward the spot where Derek had parked his Porsche. I scanned the pristine concrete. There, crushed near the edge of the flower bed, was a discarded cigarette butt. I bent down, ignoring the stiffness in my knees, and picked it up with a second plastic bag. 2 pieces of physical evidence. 2 biological keys to destroy a 5-year-long deception. I slipped the bags into the pocket of my coat. I waited until the house was silent. At midnight, I slipped out through the side entrance. I drove my modest sedan, leaving the luxury vehicles in the garage to avoid attention. The streets of Boston were slick with a light rain. I drove 20 miles outside the city, navigating toward a secluded 24-hour diner near the industrial shipyard. It was a place where corporate executives never went. A place where absolute privacy was guaranteed. I parked in the shadows and walked inside. I slid into a cracked leather booth in the far back corner. 10 minutes later, the diner door swung open. Bradley Lawson walked in. He was 60 years old, wearing a sharp trench coat. Bradley was not just my attorney. He was an absolute shark in the courtroom, a man who had helped me ruthlessly dismantle corporate rivals for 3 decades. He slid into the booth across from me, his sharp eyes scanning my face. "You look terrible," William Bradley said quietly. "When you called me on a secure line at midnight, I assumed it was about Catherine's estate. I am so deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Bradley. But I am not here to discuss Catherine. I am here because my son and my daughter-in-law are actively trying to destroy me." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the clear plastic folder containing the shredded, reconstructed Porsche receipt. I slid it across the table. Bradley put on his reading glasses and examined the document. His professional demeanor instantly sharpened. "This is an authorization for $120,000, Bradley noted, his voice lowering into a dangerous murmur. "Signed by Preston. Billed to a vendor called Apex Design Consulting. I do not recognize this vendor, William. Neither do I," I replied coldly. I bypassed the executive dashboard tonight and dug into the raw transaction logs. Preston has authorized over $4 million to this shell company over the last 8 months. He did it while Catherine was dying. I need you to initiate a covert forensic audit immediately. Track every single penny that went into Apex Design. Find out who owns it, where the money is going, and who is pulling the strings. Bradley's jaw tightened. He pulled a secure, encrypted laptop from his briefcase and booted it up. "Consider it done," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "If Preston is funneling corporate funds into a ghost account, I will have the paper trail fully mapped out within 72 hours. But William, if we expose this, Preston faces severe federal charges. Wire fraud, embezzlement. He is your son. Are you absolutely certain you want to cross this bridge? He made his choice the moment he decided to bleed my company dry and lock me in a nursing home. But the money is only half of the betrayal." I reached into my coat pocket one more time. I pulled out the 2 plastic bags, one containing the water glass, the other containing the crushed cigarette butt. I placed them deliberately on the table right next to the shredded receipt. Bradley stopped typing. He looked at the bags, then up at me, deep confusion etching lines across his forehead. "What is this?" he asked cautiously. "The glass belongs to my grandson Leo," I stated, keeping my voice dangerously steady. "The cigarette belongs to a man named Derek, who conveniently showed up today driving a brand new Porsche purchased by Apex Design. He and Victoria are very close, and he and Leo share the exact same physical mannerisms. Bradley stared at the evidence, the horrifying implication dawning on him. He slowly took off his glasses. "My God," he whispered. "You suspect the boy is not Preston's son." "I do not suspect anything, Bradley." "I know. But I need the undeniable science to prove it. I want a DNA test run on these samples. I want the results expedited, and I want it done securely through your private medical contacts. No one in my family can know. I need the weapon fully loaded before I pull the trigger." Bradley nodded slowly, carefully packing the plastic bags into his briefcase. "I will have the lab run a complete panel. We will have the results in 3 days. William, if you are right about this, Victoria has orchestrated an incredibly massive fraud. She is positioning a biological stranger to inherit the entire Stanford legacy." I leaned back against the cracked leather seat. That is exactly her plan. But she made one critical mistake. She thought my grief made me weak. She thought I was a clueless old man who would just roll over and die. I am going to let her believe she is winning. I am going to smile at her every single morning. And when she is completely comfortable, I am going to drop the sky on her head. Bradley did not smile. His eyes were glued to his laptop screen. The soft blue light illuminated his face, casting harsh shadows across his cheekbones. He had been running a preliminary trace on the Apex Design routing numbers while we spoke. I watched as all the color rapidly drained from his face. He stopped breathing for a solid 5 seconds. "What is it?" I demanded, leaning forward. Bradley slowly turned the laptop screen toward me. His hands were actually trembling. "William," he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The $4 million was just the testing phase. They have successfully bypassed the secondary security protocols on the primary Stanford Trust accounts. They have scheduled a massive automated offshore wire transfer." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Bradley looked me dead in the eyes. "They are not just stealing the cash reserves, William. They have liquidated the commercial bonds. They are emptying your entire legacy by Friday." Bradley's words hung in the stale air of the diner like a death sentence. By Friday, they were going to liquidate everything I had built over 40 years and vanish. I looked at the glowing blue screen of Bradley's laptop, watching the automated pending transfers. The sheer scale of their greed was breathtaking. I told Bradley to prepare the legal injunctions, but to hold off on freezing the accounts until I gave the absolute final signal. I needed them to feel completely victorious. If we moved too soon, Victoria would claim it was a corporate misunderstanding, a tax strategy, or some other fabricated lie. I needed to catch them with their hands locked firmly inside the vault. I drove back to the estate as the sun began to rise over Boston. When I walked through the front doors, the house was just waking up. I knew exactly what I had to do. If Victoria and Preston wanted a declining dementia-ridden old man, I was going to give them an Oscar-worthy performance. Over the next 2 days, I orchestrated a masterpiece of perceived mental decay. At breakfast, I poured orange juice into my coffee mug and stared at it with profound confusion. I purposefully forgot the name of our longtime housekeeper, calling her by my late sister's name. I would walk into the kitchen, look around blankly, and ask Preston what day of the week it was. When I performed these calculated acts of frailty, I watched Victoria. She was absolutely intoxicated by my rapid decline. She stopped lowering her voice when she spoke to Preston about her plans. She stopped pretending to care. She began treating me like a ghost that was already vacating the premises. My perceived weakness was her absolute source of power. It was Wednesday afternoon, exactly 2 days before their planned financial massacre. I was walking up the grand staircase, gripping the railing with trembling hands, playing my part. As I approached the master wing, a sharp, abrasive sound echoed from down the hall. It was the heavy, unmistakable sound of a thick plastic trash bag being dragged across hardwood floors. I moved slowly toward the open doors of the master suite, the bedroom I had shared with Catherine for 4 decades. I stood in the doorway, and the sight before me nearly shattered my carefully crafted facade. Victoria was standing in the middle of Catherine's massive closet. She was holding a heavy black garbage bag. She was casually ripping my late wife's expensive silk blouses, vintage dresses, and cashmere coats off their wooden hangers and stuffing them into the trash. She was not folding them. She was not organizing them for donation. She was throwing them away like worthless rags. "What are you doing?" asked, letting my voice shake with genuine emotion. Victoria did not even flinch. She tossed a beautiful emerald green coat into the plastic bag and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "William, you startled me. Do not sneak up on people like that. I am clearing out this space. You obviously do not need all this clutter anymore. It is completely depressing." "But those are Catherine's things," I whispered, clutching the doorframe. Victoria rolled her eyes, tying a harsh knot at the top of the garbage bag. "Catherine is gone, William. You need to accept that." Preston and I agreed that this suite gets the best morning light in the entire house. I am bringing in contractors tomorrow to tear out these outdated shelves. I am turning this room into my private yoga studio. I cannot focus on my wellness with all these dusty clothes hanging around. A private yoga studio. My wife had not been in the ground for a full week, and this parasite was throwing her life into heavy black trash bags to make room for yoga mats. The disrespect was so profound, so intensely violating, that the edges of my vision actually went black. My hands dropped to my sides. I clenched my fists so incredibly hard that I felt my trimmed fingernails pierce directly through the skin of my palms. A warm trickle of blood pooled inside my closed hands. Every muscle in my chest screamed to cross the room, grab her by the shoulders, and throw her directly out of the second-story window. But the trap was not ready. Friday was 2 days away. I needed her to stay. If I unleashed my wrath right now, she would simply pack her bags, take my grandson, and run before Bradley could completely freeze her hidden offshore accounts. I had to swallow my pride. I took a deep, agonizing breath, letting the metallic taste of adrenaline fade. Every instinct demanded violence, but strategy demanded absolute patience. Revenge is a dish best served on paper. I yielded to her. I hid it. I forced my bleeding hands to relax inside my coat pockets. I lowered my head, adopting the posture of a completely broken, defeated man. "You are right, Victoria," I muttered softly, staring at the floor. "It is just clutter now. Do whatever you think is best." She smiled her cold, triumphant smile. "I am glad you are finally being reasonable, William. Now go downstairs. The cleaning staff is moving these bags to the alley dumpsters." I turned around and slowly walked away, leaving her to desecrate the only space Catherine and I had left. I went to my study and wrapped my bleeding hands in a towel, staring at the grandfather clock. The fury inside me was no longer a burning fire. It was absolute freezing ice. I waited until 2 o'clock. The mansion was dead silent. A heavy thunderstorm had rolled in off the coast, battering the large glass windows with driving rain. I slipped out the back door, ignoring the freezing downpour. I walked down the stone pathway toward the massive industrial dumpsters near the service entrance. The security lights flickered above me. My focus was entirely consumed by the grim task back at hand. I refused to let Victoria erase 40 years of beautiful history just to satisfy her hollow, superficial vanity. I opened the heavy metal lid. Victoria had forced the staff to throw at least 6 heavy black bags into the bin. I was not going to let her rot in an alleyway. I climbed into the dumpster, my expensive leather shoes sinking into the grime. I hauled the heavy bags out one by one, dragging them quietly toward the detached carriage house, where I could safely store them. I brought the last bag into the dry warmth of the carriage house. The plastic had torn on the rough concrete. As I knelt down to gently push the spilled garments back inside, my hand brushed against something hard and metallic, hidden deep within the folds of the fabric. I paused. I reached into the ripped bag and pulled out Catherine's emerald green cashmere coat, the exact coat Victoria had casually tossed aside while I stood in the doorway. I slipped my hand into the deep side pocket. My fingers wrapped around a small, heavy rectangular object. I pulled it out into the dim light of the carriage house. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone. It was completely out of place among the luxury items in our home. Victoria had obviously been using it while clearing out the closet and must have accidentally dropped it into the pocket of the coat before throwing it in the trash. I stared at the dark screen. The device felt heavy in my palm, humming with unspoken secrets. I pushed the small plastic power button firmly on the right side. The cracked screen slowly illuminated the cold, damp room, glaring brightly and demanding a simple 4-digit security passcode to unlock. I stared at the glowing number pad, the harsh artificial light reflecting off the cold, concrete walls of the carriage house. 4 digits stood between me and the unvarnished truth. My thumb hovered over the screen, tempted to try Victoria's birth year, or perhaps the anniversary she shared with my foolish son. But my corporate discipline instantly overrode the urge. I had spent decades securing proprietary algorithms and protecting trade secrets. I knew that burner phones were often programmed with self-destruct protocols. A few incorrect guesses could trigger an automatic factory reset, permanently wiping the memory and destroying the very evidence I desperately needed to finalize my trap. I could not leave this to chance. I powered the device down, watching the screen fade to black. I slipped the phone securely into my inner breast pocket. I needed someone who specialized in digital extraction, someone who operated entirely outside the boundaries of polite corporate law. During the aggressive expansion of Stanford developments in the early 2000s, I had occasionally utilized the services of private intelligence contractors to vet massive land acquisitions. I walked back to my study and accessed an encrypted offline directory I had not opened in over 7 years. I found the contact information for a man named Silas. He was a black market data retrieval expert, a digital ghost who made his living cracking impossible devices for high-paying discreet clients. I sent a heavily encrypted message detailing the phone model and my urgent need for a clean extraction. Within 3 minutes, my secure line received a set of coordinates located in the deep industrial sector of the city. The storm had intensified, battering my windshield with sheets of relentless rain as I drove through the desolate, flooded streets. The coordinates led me to a windowless concrete warehouse surrounded by razor wire fencing. I pulled my coat tight against the bitter wind and knocked heavily on the reinforced steel door. It opened smoothly, revealing a sterile, brightly lit room filled with massive server racks and humming cooling fans. Silas sat behind a stainless steel desk, his eyes illuminated by 3 massive monitors. He did not ask for my name, and he did not offer his own. We operated on the universal language of quiet desperation and untraceable cash. I placed the black burner phone on the metal desk, followed by a thick envelope containing $20,000 in crisp, unmarked bills. Silas picked up the envelope, weighed it expertly in his hand, and gave a brief, satisfied nod. He connected the burner phone to a complex series of adapters, linking it directly into his primary mainframe. He typed, furiously running proprietary decryption software designed to bypass the operating system without triggering the internal security wipes. The room was filled with the rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard and the steady drone of the cooling fans. I stood perfectly still, my wet clothes clinging to my skin, watching the progress bar crawl across the center screen. My chest felt incredibly tight. 40 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then a sharp, melodic chime echoed through the room. The primary monitor flashed a bright green color. The digital lock had been successfully bypassed. Silas gracefully disconnected the device, plugged it into an external hard drive, and copied the entire unencrypted contents. He handed the physical phone back to me along with a small silver flash drive containing every single text, photo, and call log stored on the device. I returned to my estate just as the early morning light began to break through the heavy storm clouds. The house remained dead quiet. I locked myself inside my private study, pulled the heavy blackout curtains closed, and plugged the silver flash drive into my isolated desktop computer. The file directory opened instantly. I clicked on the master message log, sorting the texts chronologically. The sheer volume of communication was staggering. Victoria and Derek had been exchanging hundreds of messages every single week for the past 5 years. As I began to read, the true depth of their depravity washed over me like toxic sludge. The messages were a masterclass in calculated manipulation. They mocked my son ruthlessly. They called Preston a pathetic, gullible weakling, a useful idiot who was blindly funding their luxurious lifestyle. They laughed about the expensive vacations Preston had paid for trips, where Victoria had secretly smuggled Derek into the same 5-star resorts. But the romantic and mocking texts were merely the background noise to their true objective. The real focus of their constant communication was the systematic, permanent dismantling of the Stanford family empire. I scrolled through the most recent exchanges, reading the meticulous strategies they had outlined for the upcoming quarter. Victoria was not just satisfied with the $4 million she had successfully siphoned through Apex Design. She wanted the entire kingdom. The texts revealed a highly detailed, aggressive plot centered entirely around the annual Stanford Development's shareholder meeting, which was scheduled to take place next month. Victoria had been actively coaching Derek on corporate bylaws. Their plan was devastatingly simple and flawlessly timed. Victoria intended to weaponize my grief over Catherine. She was going to stand before the executive board, shed fake tears, and publicly declare that my mental state was rapidly deteriorating. She planned to use my recent acts of staged confusion as documented proof that I was no longer fit to lead the company. Her endgame was to pressure the board into forcing my immediate resignation, legally transferring the title of Chief Executive Officer to Preston. Once Preston held absolute legal control over the company, Victoria would manipulate him into signing a devastating merger with a phantom conglomerate completely controlled by Derek. They were going to legally strip the company of its assets, bankrupt the entire corporate structure, and walk away with tens of millions of dollars, leaving my son holding the bag for massive federal fraud. My blood ran incredibly cold as I absorbed the magnitude of their corporate sabotage. I leaned forward, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitor, and scrolled down to the very last message in the queue. It had been sent by Derek just yesterday afternoon, right after he had picked up Leo in the driveway. The text was short, but it held the absolute power to completely destroy everything Victoria had built. I read the words slowly, carefully analyzing the final, undeniable proof of her ultimate sin. Derek had written the exact confirmation I needed to seal their fate. He typed, "Are you sure the kid's DNA won't be questioned by the board? If the old man transfers the shares to Leo, we are multimillionaires." The arrogance of that single sentence was staggering. They believed they had outsmarted a man who had spent a lifetime destroying corporate predators. I sat in the dim light of my office, listening to the heavy rain hitting the window panes. My hands were perfectly steady. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was the architect of their destruction. I safely unplugged the silver flash drive and securely locked it inside my hidden floor safe. The trap was now fully armed and ready to snap shut. The heavy steel door of my hidden floor safe clicked shut, sealing the silver flash drive in absolute darkness. I stood up slowly, feeling the chill of the damp morning air seeping through the thick window panes of my study. The storm outside was finally beginning to break, leaving behind a bruised gray sky that perfectly matched the cold resolve settling over my mind. I walked over to my mahogany desk and sat down in the leather executive chair. The silence of the massive house was suffocating, thick with the weight of the secrets I had just uncovered. Then the silence was shattered by the sharp ringing of my private cellular phone. I glanced at the caller identification screen. It was Bradley Lawson. My trusted attorney never called this early in the morning unless he had absolute concrete confirmation of a corporate disaster. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear, not saying a single word. William Bradley said, his voice unusually tight and gravely serious. "I need you to come down to my office immediately. The forensic audit is completely finished. I have the preliminary reports printed and waiting on my desk." I took a slow breath, feeling my pulse quicken. "And the medical laboratory results?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. They arrived 10 minutes ago, Bradley replied, a heavy pause lingering in the air. You need to see all of this in person, William. Use the private underground parking garage. I will have my security team escort you directly up to the secure executive floor. I hung up the phone and stood up. I walked to the adjoining bathroom, splashed cold water on my tired face, and stared at my reflections in the gilded mirror. The grieving, fragile widower was officially dead. I adjusted my collar, put on my darkest tailored suit, and walked out the door. The drive into downtown Boston was a blur of gray concrete and rushing traffic. I navigated the sleek corporate sedan into the subterranean parking structure of Bradley's high-rise office building. 2 armed security guards were waiting near the private elevators. They nodded respectfully, swiping a secure access card that sent the steel carriage shooting directly up to the 50th floor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a pristine glass-walled reception area. Bradley was standing by the panoramic window of his corner office, looking out over the city skyline. He turned around as I walked in, his face drawn and pale. He gestured toward a heavy leather chair positioned opposite his massive desk. I sat down, resting my hands firmly on the armrests. The surface of the desk was covered in thick stacks of financial ledgers, banking statements, and legal routing documents. The paper trail of my son's ultimate betrayal was laid out in agonizing detail. Tell me everything, I commanded softly. Bradley picked up the top file, a dense collection of international wire transfer receipts and offshore banking confirmations. You were completely right. William Bradley began, his tone purely clinical. Apex Design. Consulting is nothing but a phantom corporation. It has no actual employees, no physical headquarters, and no legitimate client roster. The business license was registered in a notorious offshore tax haven just 3 weeks before the very first wire transfer was authorized by Preston. I leaned forward, staring at the damning paperwork. And the ownership, I asked. Who exactly is controlling the shadow accounts? Bradley flipped to the second page of the audit, highlighting a specific signature block with his silver pen. The sole proprietor of Apex Design is a man named Derek Vance, the exact same man who showed up in your driveway driving that imported Porsche. He is the sole beneficiary of the corporate shell. I felt a surge of pure burning anger. Derek, Victoria's supposedly distant cousin, the man who had sneered at my estate with greedy, possessive eyes. They did not just steal from the cash reserves. Bradley continued, his voice dropping into a grim whisper. We tracked the routing numbers through 3 different international clearinghouses. Over the last 8 months, Preston has authorized 47 separate transactions. They have successfully laundered $4.2 million entirely out of Stanford developments. The money was washed through fake invoicing processed as international marketing expenses and deposited directly into Derek's private offshore trusts. I stared at the ledgers, the stark reality of the numbers burning into my mind. $4.2 million. It was a staggering amount of capital stolen under the guise of corporate expansion while my wife was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Preston had blindly handed over the keys to the kingdom, funding his own wife's illicit affair and financing his own corporate destruction. Victoria played him perfectly, I murmured, my voice dripping with cold disgust. She used his arrogance and his pathetic need to prove himself as an executive. She convinced him to sign those contracts, knowing he would never bother to properly vet the vendor. She fed him a lie about Catherine approving the deal, and he swallowed it whole. Bradley closed the financial folder, lacing his fingers together on top of the desk. The financial theft is absolutely devastating, William. We have enough evidence right here to send both Preston and Derek to federal prison for a very long time, but that is only the first half of the tragedy. Bradley slowly opened the top drawer of his desk. He reached inside and pulled out a sealed, thick manila envelope. The stark white logo of an elite private medical laboratory was stamped across the front. The room grew incredibly quiet. The faint, rhythmic hum of the building's climate control system was the only sound echoing in the heavy silence. Bradley slid the manila envelope across the polished mahogany wood. It came to a stop just inches from my hands. "This is the bitter pill," William Bradley whispered, his eyes filled with profound sympathy. I rushed the samples through my most trusted clinical contacts. They worked through the night to sequence the genetic markers from the water glass and the cigarette butt. The results are completely undeniable. I stared at the brown paper, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I reached out my fingers, grasping the edge of the envelope. I tore the seal open, pulling out a single sheet of crisp white medical paper. My eyes instantly scanned past the complex scientific jargon, jumping straight to the bold, highlighted conclusion printed at the very bottom of the page. The probability of paternity is 99.9%. The child Leo is a direct biological match to the adult male Derek. The paper slipped from my trembling fingers, fluttering silently onto the desk. The air left my lungs. Preston was not the father. My beautiful, innocent grandson, the boy I loved and cherished, was a biological stranger. Victoria had orchestrated a 5-year-long multi-million-dollar con. She had planted Derek's child in my home, married my foolish son, and methodically drained my legacy to build her own empire. The ultimate betrayal was now fully exposed in the light. I left Bradley's office with the manila envelope resting heavily inside my breast pocket, pressing against my chest like a block of solid ice. The drive back to the estate felt like navigating through a thick, suffocating fog. The reality of Victoria's 5-year-long con played on a continuous loop in my mind. She had brought another man's child into my home, accepted my late wife's endless warmth and generosity, and weaponized my own son's foolishness to steal an empire I had spent 40 years building with my bare hands. Every brick of my house, every dollar in my accounts, had been targeted by a pair of ruthless parasites. But they had severely miscalculated. They thought they were hunting a wounded animal. They did not realize they had just summoned the wolf. When I walked through the grand mahogany front doors of the estate, the house was perfectly quiet. I found Preston and Victoria in the main living room. Victoria was lounging on the pristine white sofa, idly scrolling through a designer catalog on her tablet. Preston was pouring a glass of expensive scotch at the wet bar, celebrating a victory he had not yet fully achieved. I paused in the archway, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, rounding my spine to appear fragile and entirely defeated. I let my hands shake visibly as I gripped the wooden frame of the doorway. "Preston, Victoria," I rasped, making my voice sound weak and painfully exhausted. "I need to speak with both of you." Preston looked up, masking his annoyance with a quick, practiced look of concern. He set his glass down and walked over, guiding me to a plush leather armchair. "What is it, Dad?" he asked softly. "You do not look well at all. You are extremely pale." "I am not well, Preston," I whispered, staring down at my trembling hands. "I have spent the last few days trying to deny it, trying to convince myself that I could push through this grief. But Catherine is gone, and without her I simply do not have the strength anymore. My mind feels clouded. My chest aches constantly. I cannot lead Stanford Developments in this condition. The company deserves a strong, focused leader." Victoria slowly set her tablet down on the glass coffee table. Her eyes widened, sparkling with a sudden, poorly concealed intensity. She leaned forward, hanging on my every word like a predator smelling fresh blood. "What are you saying, William?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. I looked at my son, forcing a tear to well up in the corner of my eye. "I am saying that it is time for me to step down," I replied quietly. "You have proven yourself, Preston. You understand the modern market. I have spoken with legal representation. At the executive board meeting this coming Friday, I am going to officially resign as Chief Executive Officer. I will sign my majority voting shares directly over to you. Furthermore, I am restructuring the Stanford Family Trust. Everything will bypass probate, and be placed immediately into a secure, untouchable fund for my rightful grandson, little Leo. He is the future of this family. I want his legacy completely guaranteed. The silence in the living room was absolute. Preston stared at me, his mouth slightly open, utterly stunned that the kingdom was being handed over so easily. But Victoria did not hesitate. The mask of the caring, sympathetic daughter-in-law completely dissolved, replaced by a radiant, almost manic euphoria. She practically leapt off the sofa, rushing over to kneel beside my chair. She grabbed my trembling hands in hers, squeezing them with a painful, triumphant grip. "William, that is the most beautiful, selfless decision you could possibly make." Victoria gushed, her eyes burning with pure greed. "We are so incredibly proud of you for recognizing your limitations. You are doing the right thing for the company and for our precious Leo. We will honor your legacy perfectly. You have absolutely nothing to worry about anymore." Preston finally found his voice, puffing out his chest with unearned arrogance. He adjusted his suit jacket, suddenly standing taller. "You are making the right choice, Dad. I will take the reins and guide Stanford developments into a massive global future. You can finally rest." "Speaking of rest," Victoria chimed in quickly, standing up and smoothing down her pristine skirt. "Now that the corporate transition is settled, we need to finalize your personal transition." I looked up at her, feigning mild confusion. "My personal transition?" I asked weakly. "Yes, William," she replied smoothly, crossing her arms. "Silver Pines Luxury Health Retreat. We already discussed this. You just admitted your mind is failing and your health is deteriorating. You cannot stay in this massive empty house. It is simply not safe for you. I have already contacted the admissions director. They have a beautiful private suite available starting this weekend." I blinked slowly, letting my mouth hang open slightly. "You want me to leave the estate by this weekend," I murmured. "It is for your own good, Dad," Preston added, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with his wife. "The medical staff at Silver Pines can monitor your cognitive decline. We will visit you, of course. But you need professional supervision." I stared at the two of them. They were not even trying to hide their eagerness to throw me away. The ink on the corporate transfer documents was not even dry, and they were already evicting me from the home I built for my family. I lowered my head, staring at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. "Okay," I whispered in a defeated tone. "If you both think it is for the best." "We do," Victoria said sharply. Her tone had completely changed. There was no more soothing, fake sympathy. She was now the master of the house, and I was merely an unwanted burden. "You should start packing your things immediately, William. Just take the essentials. The facility provides uniforms and basic toiletries. I will have the housekeeping staff bring up some cardboard boxes for the rest of your clutter. I want that study cleared out by Thursday evening so the interior decorators can begin measuring the space." I nodded silently, playing the obedient broken elder to absolute perfection. I slowly pushed myself out of the chair, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, and began the long, humiliating walk up the grand staircase. Behind me, I heard the distinct, sharp pop of a champagne cork. Victoria let out a loud, joyous laugh, clinking her glass against Preston's. They were celebrating the end of my life. I reached the top of the stairs and walked down the long corridor toward my private study. The moment I crossed the threshold and locked the heavy oak doors behind me, my posture instantly straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished. The frail, confused old man evaporated into the cool, silent air of the room, leaving only the ruthless corporate founder standing in his place. I walked briskly to my desk and opened the secure floor safe. I pulled out the extensive forensic audit Bradley had compiled, the DNA laboratory results, and the decrypted files from Victoria's burner phone. I arranged the damning evidence in perfectly neat stacks across the polished mahogany wood. I sat down in my leather chair, picked up my secure encrypted cellular phone, and dialed a direct, unlisted number I had kept carefully memorized for over a decade. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. Special Agent Miller speaking." "Agent Miller," I said, my voice smooth, commanding, and perfectly steady. My name is William Stanford, founder and Chief Executive Officer of Stanford Developments. I am calling to report a massive ongoing wire fraud and embezzlement operation taking place within my own corporation. There was a brief pause on the line. The agent immediately recognized my name. The Stanford Empire was a cornerstone of the regional economy. Mr. Stanford, the agent replied, his tone shifting into high alert. Do you have physical evidence to support these allegations? I have a complete forensic audit detailing over $4 million laundered through international shell companies, I stated calmly. I have the offshore routing numbers, the phantom vendor contracts, and the decrypted internal communications of the conspirators actively planning to execute a hostile corporate takeover and drain the remaining assets this coming Friday. Who are the primary suspects, Mr. Stanford? The agent asked, the sound of rapid typing echoing over the line. The primary suspects are my Chief Operating Officer, Preston Stanford, and a civilian accomplice named Derek Vance, I replied coldly. I am prepared to hand over all physical and digital evidence immediately. I want your finest forensic accountants at my estate tonight. We have exactly 48 hours to set a trap they cannot possibly escape. While Victoria was downstairs drinking expensive champagne and planning the layout of her new yoga studio, I was quietly, methodically building the guillotine that would sever her from my life forever. The board meeting on Friday was not going to be a transfer of power. It was going to be an absolute massacre. Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept off the Boston harbor, carrying away the storm. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room, adjusting the collar of my charcoal suit. For the past week, I had purposefully worn slightly wrinkled clothes and slouched my shoulders to sell the illusion of a rapidly decaying mind. Today, I dressed exactly like the man who had built a $40 million empire from nothing. I secured my silk tie, slid the heavy watch onto my wrist, and placed the secure leather portfolio containing the forensic audit. The digital extractions and the DNA laboratory results into my briefcase. I walked down the grand staircase of the estate for what I knew would be the very last time under these circumstances. The house stood quiet. Preston and Victoria had already left in the chauffeured vehicle, eager to arrive early and secure their perceived victory. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air, and slid into the back seat of my private sedan. I instructed my new driver to head straight to the downtown financial district. The city rushed past the windows, a blur of gray concrete and morning commuters. My mind was perfectly still, calibrated to the exact frequency of corporate warfare. The Stanford Developments Tower stood 50 stories high, a monument of glass and steel that I had personally designed and funded. I stepped out of the sedan and walked through the revolving glass doors of the grand lobby. The security guards and front desk attendants stood a little taller as I passed, offering respectful nods. I bypassed the standard elevators and used my keycard to access the private executive lift. The ride up to the 40th floor took exactly 45 seconds. With every floor that passed, I let the remaining grief over Catherine fade into the background, replacing it entirely with cold, calculated resolve. The elevator doors chimed and slid open, revealing the pristine marble floors and frosted glass walls of the executive suite. I walked down the long corridor toward the primary boardroom. The heavy oak double doors were already open. I paused just outside the frame, listening to the muffled sounds of the room. The board of directors, consisting of 5 men and 2 women who had worked alongside me for decades, were already seated in their high-backed leather chairs. They were murmuring quietly among themselves, no doubt discussing the sudden, shocking agenda of my alleged resignation. I stepped into the boardroom, and a hushed silence immediately fell over the long mahogany table. I took my customary seat at the very head of the table, placing my leather briefcase carefully by my feet. I offered a polite, muted smile to the board members, maintaining the slight slump in my shoulders just a little bit longer. Preston was sitting directly to my right, occupying the seat traditionally reserved for the Chief Operating Officer. He looked incredibly tense, constantly adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit and refusing to make direct eye contact with anyone in the room. Victoria sat in the chair right next to him. She was not a member of the executive board, nor did she hold any official position within Stanford Developments, but she had aggressively inserted herself into this meeting under the guise of being my supportive daughter-in-law. She looked absolutely radiant, practically glowing with unchecked arrogance. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored crimson dress that commanded attention, but it was the jewelry adorning her neck and wrists that made my blood run entirely cold. She was wearing a massive, flawless diamond collar and matching tennis bracelets, pieces that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, pieces purchased with the lifeblood of my company. She sat with perfect posture, her chin tilted upward, surveying the room as if she were a queen inspecting her newly conquered subjects. She offered me a sweet, patronizing smile as I settled into my chair, treating me like a fragile patient who had wandered out of a hospital ward. The chief legal counsel, a meticulous man named Arthur, cleared his throat and opened his thick binder. He announced the official start of the quarterly shareholder meeting, reading through the preliminary financial summaries with a steady, monotonous voice. He then paused, looking directly at me with a deeply sympathetic expression. Arthur stated that the primary item on the agenda was a massive corporate restructuring, specifically addressing my request to step down as Chief Executive Officer due to rapidly declining health. The board members exchanged nervous, sorrowful glances. They had known me for years. They knew how deeply the death of Catherine impacted me, and Victoria had clearly spent the last few days laying the groundwork, whispering to everyone that my mind was completely shattered. Before I could even open my mouth to officially address the board, Victoria abruptly stood up from her chair. The harsh scraping of the wooden legs against the floor instantly silenced Arthur. She did not ask for permission to speak. She placed her hands firmly on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, her flawless diamond necklace catching the overhead lights. She completely dropped the facade of the mourning, supportive family member. The sweet, concerned tone she had perfected for the country club crowd vanished. Her voice was sharp, cutting, and dripping with absolute venom. She looked at the board members, and then she turned her piercing gaze directly onto me. Now that the old woman is gone, Victoria said, her voice echoing through the silent boardroom with stunning cruelty, there is no reason to drag this process out any longer. We know why we are here today. The mind of William is gone. He is a liability to this corporation and a burden to this family. She gestured toward Preston, who instantly lowered his head, staring intently at his own hands, complicit in his utter cowardice. Put the company in the name of my son and fend for yourself, she demanded, her eyes locked onto mine with greedy, unfiltered hatred. My son Leo is the only future this family has left. You need to sign the majority shares over immediately and get out of our way. It is time for new blood, William. Pack your bags for the nursing home and let the real executives handle the business. The entire board of directors sat in absolute paralyzed shock. They stared horrified by the sheer audacity and cruelty of her words. Preston sank lower into his chair, sweating profusely, completely unable to defend me or stop the ruthless tirade of his wife. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the undeniable tension of a hostile corporate execution. Victoria stood tall, breathing heavily, waiting for me to break down, surrender my empire, and quietly walk away into the shadows. I slowly placed my hands flat on the mahogany table. I let the frail, shaking posture vanish completely. I straightened my spine, pulled my shoulders back, and looked directly into her greedy, triumphant eyes. I smiled back, a slow, calculated expression that instantly chilled the entire room. I would love to, Victoria, but there is a slight legal technicality. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open, with a resounding, violent thud, shattering the suffocating silence Victoria had just created. Every single head at the long mahogany table snapped toward the entrance. Bradley Lawson stepped into the room. He was not wearing his usual polite, diplomatic courtroom demeanor. He wore the grim, unyielding expression of an executioner stepping up to the chopping block. Flanking him on either side were two men in dark, immaculate suits. They moved with a stiff, highly disciplined military precision that instantly commanded absolute authority. The silver badges clipped to their leather belts caught the morning light filtering through the panoramic windows. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. Preston half rose from his leather chair, his face contorting into a mask of utter bewilderment. He looked at the federal agents, then at Bradley, and finally at me. "Dad, what is going on here?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the sudden immense pressure. "Who are these people? Why did you bring them into a closed shareholder meeting?" I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Victoria. Her radiant, triumphant glow had flickered, replaced by a sudden sharp flash of predatory caution. She slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly, her knuckles turned pale white. The flawless diamond necklace around her throat seemed to suddenly weigh her down. Bradley walked methodically down the length of the room. He stopped directly across from Preston and Victoria. He unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a massive 400-page bound document. He lifted it high and dropped it flat onto the center of the mahogany table. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The thick stack of paper was a meticulously detailed forensic audit, representing every single stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every shattered piece of trust. "This meeting is no longer about executive succession," Bradley announced, his voice booming with absolute clarity. "This is an active federal crime scene. My client, William Stanford, has officially filed charges of gross corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy against the chief operating officer of this company." The board members gasped collectively. A senior director at the far end of the table pressed a hand over his mouth in genuine shock. Arthur, our chief legal counsel, hastily pushed his chair back, distancing himself from Preston as if the boy had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. Preston swallowed hard. He looked like a man standing on the tracks watching a freight train barreling toward him. "Bradley, you have completely lost your mind," Preston argued weakly, looking desperately around the room for any shred of support. "There is absolutely no fraud. Everything I have done has been for the expansion of Stanford developments." Bradley did not even blink. He opened the massive binder to the very first tab. "Let us discuss your version of corporate expansion, Preston. Over the last 8 months, while your mother was dying, you authorized 47 separate wire transfers to an international vendor, known as Apex Design Consulting. You explicitly claimed this was an elite European marketing firm. Our forensic accountants, working in strict tandem with the Financial Crimes Unit, have spent the last 48 hours tearing that claim apart. Apex Design Consulting is a ghost company. It has 0 employees, 0 physical offices, and 0 marketing campaigns. It is a phantom shell corporation registered in an offshore tax haven designed solely to bleed this company dry. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face flushed a deep, sickly red, then drained to an ashen, terrifying gray. Victoria remained perfectly still, her eyes darting between the federal agents and the audit on the table, her mind desperately calculating a way out of the collapsing room. "You siphoned exactly $4,200,000 out of the Stanford cash reserves." Bradley continued, relentlessly reading directly from the financial ledgers. "You bypassed the secondary security protocols by breaking the transfers into smaller, staggered increments. You then liquidated the commercial bonds, preparing to empty the primary trust accounts by tomorrow morning. You thought you were being incredibly clever, but you left a massive digital footprint. We tracked every single penny through 3 different international clearinghouses directly into a private offshore trust." Preston raised his hands in a frantic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Wait," he begged, looking at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Dad, please. You have to understand. I did not want to do this. Mom told me to do it. She approved the vendor. She told me it was completely necessary for the future." "Do not ever speak her name again," I snarled, my voice vibrating with a raw, primal fury that made several board members physically flinch in their seats. "Do not dare use my dead wife to shield your pathetic crimes. Catherine built this company with me. She would have never authorized a phantom vendor. and she certainly would have never funneled millions of dollars directly into the pockets of a man named Derek Vance. The moment I spoke Derek's name, Victoria violently flinched. The illusion of her perfect control completely shattered. The arrogant queen was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. But her deeply ingrained greed was far stronger than her fear. She could not fathom losing the luxurious empire she felt she inherently deserved. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger directly at Bradley. "You cannot do this!" Victoria screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly against the frosted glass walls. "You are completely out of line. This is a private family matter, not a federal crime. My husband is the chief operating officer. He has the absolute legal authority to direct company funds wherever he sees fit for the growth of this corporation." Bradley looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. "Embezzlement is not a growth strategy, Victoria." "I do not care what you call it," Victoria shouted, slamming her hands against the mahogany table. She turned her furious glare toward me, dropping all pretenses of respect. "You cannot touch that money, William. You cannot freeze those offshore accounts. That money belongs to my family. My son Leo is the direct legal heir to the Stanford Trust. You put it in writing when he was born. You established an irrevocable generational wealth transfer. The court will protect his assets. No judge in this state will allow you to legally bankrupt your own flesh and blood. You are trapped, you senile old fool. Leo is a Stanford, and that money is his absolute birthright." The entire boardroom held its collective breath, stunned by the sheer venom radiating from her perfectly painted lips. Victoria stood tall, her chest rising and falling rapidly, genuinely believing that the biological shield of her 5-year-old son made her absolutely untouchable. Bradley looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of any mercy. He slowly shook his head. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a crisp, sealed manila envelope. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of heavy white paper bearing a bright blue certified medical seal. Bradley held the document up to the light, ensuring every single member of the board could clearly see the official embossed seal of the medical laboratory. The silence in the room was so absolute that the faint rustling of the heavy paper sounded like a roaring fire. Victoria abruptly stopped breathing. The triumphant sneer she had worn just moments ago melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She instantly recognized the distinct logo printed on the official letterhead. It was the premier genetic testing facility in Boston. Bradley adjusted his reading glasses and looked directly at my trembling son. "Preston," Bradley began, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or legal maneuvering. "When your father established the primary Stanford Family Trust 30 years ago, he insisted on a very specific ironclad clause. It is a standard protective measure for corporate empires of this magnitude. The internal bylaws explicitly dictate that any generational transfer of wealth, corporate shares, or executive voting power can only be bequeathed to a direct biological bloodline heir." Preston blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "I do not understand what you are talking about, Bradley. Leo is my son. He is the direct heir." "Victoria just said so," Preston added weakly, shaking slightly. "Victoria has said a great many things," Bradley replied coldly. "But the science says something entirely different. Acting on William's direct orders, I secured biological samples from your son Leo and from the man Victoria brought to your home yesterday. The man she claimed was a distant cousin named Derek." Victoria lunged forward, her hands slamming violently onto the mahogany table. "You have absolutely no right to do this. That is a gross violation of privacy. You cannot legally test my child without my explicit consent. This is a criminal action." "I can, and I did," I interjected, my voice cutting through her panic like a sharpened razor. "As the legal owner of the estate where the discarded biological material was collected, the samples were obtained completely legally. Read the final results, Bradley." Bradley looked back down at the medical document. He cleared his throat, projecting his voice so it echoed against the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. "According to the comprehensive genetic panel processed and completely verified by 2 independent laboratory directors, The probability of paternity between Derek Vance and the child Leo is 99.9%. Bradley paused, letting the devastating medical conclusion hang heavily in the cold air. Preston, you are not the father of this boy. Leo is the biological son of Derek Vance. The words dropped into the center of the boardroom like a live grenade. The senior directors gasped loudly. One of the female board members pressed her hand over her heart, staring at Victoria in sheer disbelief. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, completely destroying the grand illusion Victoria had so carefully maintained. She had not just stolen corporate money. She had stolen 5 entire years of time. Oh, she had fed my son a vicious lie every single time he looked into the beautiful eyes of a child he firmly believed was his own. Preston sat perfectly still. He looked as though all the warm blood had been violently drained from his body. His hands, which had been resting casually on the polished table, began to shake uncontrollably. He slowly turned his head to look directly at his wife, the woman he had fiercely defended against his own mother, the woman he had actively stolen millions of dollars to impress, the woman who had ruined his own life. "Victoria!" Preston whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, hollow squeak. "What is he talking about?" "Tell them it is a lie. Tell them this is just a terrible mistake." Victoria scrambled backward, her heavy chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. Her flawless composure was completely obliterated. She looked exactly like a trapped rat. "It is a lie, Preston. Your father is manipulating the evidence. He fabricated this entire document to ruin us. He has always hated me, you know he does. He is just trying to take Leo away from you, to keep his precious, pathetic company forever. The laboratory directors are currently standing by on a secure conference line, Victoria," Bradley stated smoothly, tapping the dark screen of his cellular phone. "We can call them right now and have them read the exact genetic markers aloud for the entire board of directors to hear. Shall I dial the number immediately?" Victoria opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. Her panicked eyes darted wildly around the vast room, searching for an open exit, searching for a single sympathetic face. But she found absolutely nothing. The board members looked at her with utter, undisguised, total, absolute repulsion. The brilliant, untouchable queen of the Stanford Empire had been violently reduced to a pathetic, exposed fraud. The brutal reality finally broke through Preston's thick layer of denial. The absolute devastation hit his mind with staggering physical force. His chest heaved rapidly as he abruptly stood up, his heavy leather chair crashing backward onto the hard marble floor. He stared intently at the woman he loved, the mother of the child he thought was his own flesh and blood, and let out a sudden, guttural, agonizing scream. 5 years, Preston roared loudly, his face twisting in raw, deeply painful agony. "You lied to me for 5 solid years. You purposefully made me steal from my own father. You made me betray my own family. For what? So you could quietly fund a secret life with another man." Victoria backed away from the long table, holding her trembling hands up defensively in the air. "Preston, please, you have to listen to me right now. Derek meant absolutely nothing. The money was for us, for our future. I was only trying to protect our luxurious lifestyle." "You used me!" Preston screamed, hot tears streaming down his flushed, devastated, utterly broken, sobbing face. "You never loved me for a single second. You just needed a massive bank account to drain." He aggressively lunged toward her, completely losing his mind, but he never managed to reach her. The 2 federal agents standing quietly near the doorway moved forward with terrifying lightning speed. One agent effortlessly intercepted Preston, shoving him back against the wall with a firm, unyielding forearm. The second agent walked directly toward Victoria. She shrank backward, her back hitting the frosted glass wall of the boardroom. She looked up at the towering federal agent, with wide, intensely terrified eyes, panting heavily now. The agent reached out and grabbed Victoria firmly by both of her upper arms, spinning her around effortlessly. He locked her wrists securely behind her back. The cold, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing sharply through the silent boardroom. was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Victoria Stanford," the agent stated, his deep voice carrying absolute, undeniable legal authority. "You are officially under arrest for conspiracy wire fraud and gross corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of federal law right now." The cold metal snapped shut around Victoria's slender wrists with a sharp, terrifying finality. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held her in suspended disbelief. She gasped a ragged, ugly sound as the federal agent tightened the cuffs, pressing the harsh steel into her delicate skin. This was no longer a corporate dispute or a family argument that could be smoothed over with fake tears. This was the crushing weight of the federal justice system crashing down upon her constructed world. She twisted her body, attempting to pull away from the towering agent, but his grip was like a vice, absolute and unyielding. The flawless diamond bracelets that adorned her wrists clinked frantically against the heavy police restraints, a perfectly poetic contrast between the extravagant wealth she stole and the bleak future that awaited her. Victoria's eyes darted frantically around the mahogany table, searching desperately for a savior. She locked her gaze onto her husband. Preston was standing frozen near his overturned leather chair, his face slick with sweat and hot, bitter tears. The arrogant executive who walked into this boardroom 20 minutes ago had completely vanished. In his place stood a broken, humiliated shell of a man stripped of his dignity and forced to witness his spectacular ruin before the entire board of directors. "Preston, do something." Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with raw panic. "You are the chief operating officer of this company. Tell them to let me go right now. Tell them this is just a terrible misunderstanding. Do not just stand there like a coward." Preston did not move a muscle to help her. His chest heaved with ragged, uncontrollable sobs, his eyes wide and vacant as they stared through her. The realization that his marriage was a fraudulent transaction, that the child he raised was the product of another man, had completely paralyzed his mind. He was drowning in a sea of absolute crushing humiliation. He looked at her flawless face, the face that had lied to him every single day for 5 long years, and he simply shook his head. He had absolutely no power here. He never truly had any power. He had always been a pawn, and the game was over. Seeing that her husband was entirely useless, Victoria turned her desperate, pleading eyes toward me. The venom she had displayed moments earlier evaporated, replaced instantly by the pathetic facade of a frightened child. She tried to step toward me, but the federal agent held her firmly in place. "William, please," she begged, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You cannot let them take me away like this. I am the mother of your grandson. I am family. We are family. You have to stop this right now. I will give all the money back, every penny. I will sign whatever corporate documents you want me to sign. Just call off the agents. Please, William, have mercy on me. You know, I was just scared about the future. I was only trying to secure a life for the boy." I remained perfectly seated at the head of the boardroom table, hands resting calmly on the polished wood. I looked at her with dead, empty eyes. There was no anger left in my heart, no sorrow, and certainly no mercy. I felt nothing but a profound, freezing void where my familial affection used to reside. I let her desperate pleas hang in the silent room for a long moment, allowing the gravity of her failure to settle deep into her bones. "You told me to disappear from this family," I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, terrifying finality. "I am just fulfilling your wish." Victoria stared at me, the last remaining shred of her hope shattering completely. She opened her mouth to scream another excuse, but the federal agent had heard enough. He placed a heavy hand between her shoulder blades and began to march her forcefully toward the large oak doors of the boardroom. "No!" Victoria wailed, her voice escalating into a frantic shriek. "William, you cannot do this to me. I deserve that money. I earned my place in this family. Let go of me. Do not touch me." Her manic screams pierced the quiet atmosphere of the executive floor as the agents pushed her out into the main corridor. The entire 40th floor had come to an absolute standstill. The senior vice presidents, the executive assistants, the marketing directors, and the cleaning staff had all stepped out of their respective offices, drawn by the incredible commotion. These were the very same employees Victoria had spent the last 3 years ruthlessly belittling, mocking, and treating like insignificant peasants. Now they stood in silent, stunned rows, watching the impeccably dressed, arrogant queen of Stanford Developments being forcibly dragged toward the public elevators in heavy steel handcuffs. Victoria tried to hide her face behind her disheveled hair, sobbing wildly, utterly humiliated as the staff stared at her with cold, unforgiving eyes. The flawless diamond necklace sparkled under the harsh fluorescent hallway lights, serving as a bright, flashing beacon of her spectacular greed and ultimate downfall. The heavy elevator doors slid open. The agents pushed her inside and the metal doors closed, severing her completely from the empire she had tried so desperately to conquer. The silence that returned to the primary boardroom was thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable. The board of directors remained completely frozen in their high-backed leather chairs, processing the shocking theatrical destruction of a woman they had all privately despised. Bradley stood quietly near the panoramic window, his arms crossed over his chest, his grim task executed with absolute flawless precision. I slowly turned my attention back to the center of the room. Preston was still standing near his overturned chair, trembling violently, his expensive suit clinging to his sweat-soaked frame. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down upon his fragile, shattered ego. His wife was gone, arrested for massive federal wire fraud. His perceived son was the biological product of his mother's illicit lover. His entire corporate career was completely destroyed, heavily documented in a massive forensic audit that tied him directly to the theft of millions of dollars. He looked at the empty doorway where Victoria had just vanished, and then he slowly turned his tear-streaked face toward me. His eyes were wide, filled with a primal, suffocating terror. The arrogance that had fueled his betrayal was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, desperate fear of a little boy who had finally been caught stealing from his father. Preston took a shaky, unstable step toward the head of the table. His knees suddenly buckled beneath his weight, sending him crashing down onto the cold, hard marble floor. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the seated board members. He reached my chair and collapsed forward, wrapping his trembling arms tightly around my legs, burying his wet, sobbing face directly into the fabric of my trousers. Dad, Preston wept, his voice choking on his own pathetic, desperate tears. Dad, I did not know about the kid. Please save me. I am your son. I looked down at the pathetic man clinging to my trousers. The expensive fabric of his tailored suit was completely ruined, soaked in his own bitter tears and the cold sweat of absolute panic. He looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, desperately searching for the loving father who had protected him from every consequence his entire life. He expected the man who had always bailed him out of trouble to simply wave a hand and make this terrible nightmare disappear. But that father was gone. He had died the moment Victoria dragged a heavy black trash bag across the hardwood floor of the master suite. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not place a reassuring hand on his shaking shoulder. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive boardroom press down upon him. The entire executive board watched us with rapt attention, their expressions a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "You are not a victim, Preston," I said, my voice echoing off the frosted glass walls with a chilling metallic edge. "You are a coward. You stood by and watched that parasite desecrate the only space your mother and I had left. You let her rip Catherine's beautiful clothes off their hangers and throw them away like worthless garbage, and you did absolutely nothing. You smiled and poured yourself a glass of expensive scotch while she ordered me to pack my bags for a nursing home. You handed her the keys to my corporate empire because you were too weak to earn your own success. You happily sold my legacy to fund a fraudulent, pathetic illusion. You are not my son anymore. You are merely a liability." Preston recoiled physically as if my words had struck him directly in the jaw. His trembling hands released my legs and he slumped back onto his heels, his mouth opening and closing silently. I turned my attention away from him, looking toward Bradley and the remaining federal agents standing near the doorway. I then swept my gaze across the long mahogany table, addressing the stunned members of the board of directors. Effective immediately, Preston Stanford is permanently stripped of his title as Chief Operating Officer of Stanford Developments. All executive privileges, corporate access codes, and financial authorizations are hereby revoked. Furthermore, any and all unvested company shares previously allocated to him under the family trust are entirely canceled due to gross negligence and complicity in massive corporate fraud. The senior directors nodded in solemn agreement, actively recording my directives into the official meeting minutes. Preston let out a low, agonizing whimper, realizing that the protective shield of his family name had just been completely obliterated. He looked up at me, his face a portrait of utter devastation. "Please, Dad," he begged, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "I have absolutely nothing left. If you fire me, I will be destitute. You cannot just leave me with nothing." I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "I am not firing you, Preston," I replied smoothly. "Firing you would allow you to simply walk away from the catastrophic mess you helped create. Firing you would be a mercy that you absolutely do not deserve. You are going to stay right here at Stanford Developments. But you are no longer an executive. You are hereby demoted to a base-level data entry clerk. You will be relocated to the sub-basement archiving department. You will work under strict, constant supervision, logging historical financial records for 40 hours a week." Preston stared at me in sheer horror, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his punishment. "A base-level data entry clerk," he whispered, his voice cracking with fresh tears. "You cannot do that to me. I have a Master of Business Administration degree. I cannot work in a basement. You will work wherever I tell you to work." I countered, my voice rising in volume, commanding the absolute attention of the room. "You facilitated the theft of $4,200,000 from this company. Your signature is on every single fraudulent vendor contract that funneled our corporate reserves directly into Derek Vance's offshore accounts. You are going to work in that basement, and your wages will be aggressively garnished every single week until you pay back every single cent your beautiful wife stole from my empire. You will not take a vacation. You will not receive bonuses. You will spend the next 40 years of your miserable life slowly repaying your massive debt to this corporation. And if you refuse or if you attempt to resign, Bradley will personally hand your complicity files directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will join Victoria in federal prison, and you will rot in a concrete cell for the rest of your natural life. The choice is entirely yours. You can either be a prisoner of the federal justice system, or you can be a prisoner of Stanford Developments. Pick one right now." The absolute finality of my ultimatum crashed over him like a suffocating wave. Preston collapsed entirely, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, weeping with loud, uncontrollable, pathetic sobs. He had lost absolutely everything in the span of a single hour. The beautiful, treacherous wife who had manipulated his mind was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle in heavy steel handcuffs. His immense personal wealth was gone, vaporized by forensic accountants and legal asset seizures. The prestigious corporate title he had paraded around the country club had been publicly stripped away in front of his peers. And the father he had taken for granted, the man he had planned to lock away in a nursing home, was now his absolute unforgiving warden. He was completely alone, trapped in a prison of his own making. I looked at Bradley, offering a single firm nod. The attorney gathered the thick forensic audit and the genetic testing results, neatly placing them back into his leather briefcase. The board members began to quietly shuffle their papers, preparing to adjourn the most devastating shareholder meeting in the history of our company. I turned around and began to walk toward the heavy oak doors, leaving my weeping son curled up on the boardroom floor. The trap had been successfully sprung, and the parasites had been thoroughly eradicated from my business. But as I stepped out into the quiet, pristine executive corridor, a sudden heavy thought pierced through my cold satisfaction. It anchored my expensive leather shoes to the carpet. The corporate betrayal was resolved, and Victoria was finally facing justice. But a massive, complicated fragment of her elaborate deception still remained behind at the estate. I thought of the 5-year-old boy sitting in the playroom. Leo was the biological product of Derek Vance and a ruthless con artist. He possessed absolutely no Stanford blood in his veins. He was the living, breathing symbol of my ultimate humiliation. But he was also just a completely innocent young child. What exactly was I going to do about the innocent little boy named Leo? I stood in the quiet, pristine executive corridor, staring at the polished marble floor, the weight of the ultimate question resting heavily on my tired shoulders. What exactly was I going to do about the innocent little boy named Leo? I am a ruthless businessman. I have spent my entire life dissecting complex profit margins, eliminating massive corporate liabilities, and crushing adversaries who dared to cross my family. Victoria had weaponized that very family against me, using a child as a Trojan horse to infiltrate my legacy. By all logical metrics, Leo was the ultimate symbol of my profound humiliation. He was a biological stranger, the direct offspring of the man who had conspired to destroy everything I had built. The cold corporate instinct within my mind demanded that I sever all ties, completely casting the boy out, along with his treacherous mother. But as I closed my eyes, I did not see Victoria's greedy sneer or Derek's arrogant grin. I saw a 5-year-old boy sitting on the rug in the playroom, carefully stacking wooden building blocks, looking up at me with wide, bright, hopeful eyes. He did not ask to be born into a criminal conspiracy. He was merely collateral damage in a war he could not possibly comprehend. I am a hard man, but I am not a monster. Catherine had loved that little boy. She had read him bedtime stories and baked him warm sugar cookies, completely unaware of his true lineage. To abandon him entirely to the foster system or the bitter wreckage of Preston's ruined life would be a massive betrayal of the boundless compassion my late wife had brought into this dark world. I walked back into my private office, dialed Bradley's direct extension, and issued a new set of uncompromising instructions. We established a deeply insulated, fully anonymous educational trust. The parameters were incredibly strict and utterly impenetrable. The fund would cover his basic living expenses, modest housing, and comprehensive tuition for private schooling through his university graduation. However, the trust was completely ironclad. Victoria would never be allowed to access a single penny of it, and the moment Leo turned 25, the remaining funds would automatically dissolve into a charitable organization. He would receive a solid foundation for a normal life, but he was permanently severed from the Stanford billions. He would have to build his own empire, relying entirely on his own merit, far away from the toxic shadow of his mother's endless greed. With the boy's future quietly secured, I turned my full, unyielding attention back to the bleeding wounds of Stanford developments. The extensive forensic audit had exposed Victoria and Preston, but a corruption of that staggering magnitude does not exist in a total vacuum. It requires blind eyes, greased palms, and complicit silence from the middle management tier. I spent the next 3 weeks operating with the ruthless precision of a military surgeon. I systematically called every senior executive, department head, and financial controller into the main boardroom. I laid out the offshore wire transfers, the intentionally bypassed security protocols, and the purposefully neglected oversight reports. I did not accept weak excuses, and I did not tolerate pathetic apologies. Within 14 days, I formally fired 6 regional vice presidents, 2 chief accounting officers, and the entire risk management division. I aggressively stripped them of their lucrative golden parachutes and threatened them with severe federal complicity charges if they dared to request a single cent of corporate severance pay. The corporate purge was swift, brutal, and absolutely necessary. The dead weight was entirely removed, but the massive void left behind presented a beautiful new opportunity. I looked down into the lower ranks of the company, seeking the quiet, diligent employees who had been consistently passed over for promotions by Preston's arrogant, incompetent friends. I found a brilliant junior analyst named Sarah, who had repeatedly flagged the Apex Design invoices only to be threatened with immediate termination by Preston. I promoted her directly to the position of Chief Financial Officer. I elevated dedicated project managers who implicitly understood the core values Catherine and I had established decades ago. I rewarded fierce loyalty, quiet competence, and unyielding personal integrity. The culture of the massive company shifted almost overnight, returning to the solid, honorable foundation that had made it a formidable industry titan. The poison had been completely extracted, and the corporate body was finally beginning to heal. After the final termination was legally processed, and the newly appointed executive board was officially seated, I finally left the downtown tower. The bright sun was slowly setting over the beautiful Boston skyline, casting a warm golden glow across the calm harbor waters. The evening air felt incredibly lighter, much cleaner, as if a toxic, suffocating fog had finally lifted from the bustling city streets. My private driver navigated the quiet, winding residential roads back toward the sprawling estate. When the heavy wrought iron gates slowly parted, I looked up at the massive stone mansion. For several dark, agonizing months, this beautiful house had felt exactly like a cold, unforgiving tomb, a suffocating monument to my profound grief and the vile, sickening deception playing out within its historic halls. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped quietly into the grand, sweeping foyer. The house was entirely, completely empty. The chaotic, superficial energy of Victoria's endless vanity was permanently gone. Preston's pathetic, cowardly, whining presence had been completely eradicated from the premises. There were absolutely no more fake, patronizing smiles, no more whispered, greedy conspiracies, and no more heavy plastic trash bags being violently dragged across the pristine hardwood floors. I walked slowly through the immaculate main living room, my measured footsteps echoing softly against the high, intricately vaulted ceilings. I moved deliberately up the grand, sweeping staircase and down the long, shadowed upper corridor, finally stopping right in front of the master suite. The space was pristine, perfectly restored to the exact way Catherine had lovingly kept it for 40 beautiful years. The silence in the massive, sprawling estate was absolutely, profoundly deafening. It stretched out endlessly in every direction, filling every single room, hallway, and shadowed corner with a profound, unbroken, heavy stillness. But as I stood there alone in the fading, tranquil twilight, staring into the quiet darkness of my restored home, I realized something incredibly profound. The deep, echoing silence of the empty house was no longer suffocating. It was a blank canvas, a completely unwritten chapter. I had protected the legacy that Catherine and I had built. I had surgically removed the disease that had infected my family and my business. I was battered by betrayal entirely alone in the twilight, but I was unequivocally, absolutely undefeated. My name remained entirely mine. The empire was perfectly secure. I took a slow, deep, steady breath, feeling absolute peace for the very first time in a very long time. I closed the heavy wooden doors of the master suite, turned around, and walked confidently forward into the quiet night, fully prepared to continue writing the rest of my unyielding story entirely on my own terms. This was not the end. It was merely the beginning. I smiled. 6 months passed since that defining evening in the empty estate. The crisp autumn winds of Boston had eventually surrendered to a bitter, freezing winter, which in turn melted into a bright and fiercely hopeful spring. The seasons changed, and with them the entire landscape of my existence underwent a profound, irreversible transformation. The slow wheels of the federal justice system had turned with methodical, crushing precision. The trial of Victoria and Derek was a swift and brutal affair. The forensic evidence Bradley and the federal agents had compiled was absolutely airtight, leaving no room for clever legal maneuvering or sympathetic jury appeals. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom on the day of their sentencing, wearing a dark tailored suit, watching the final act of their pathetic conspiracy play out. Victoria stood before the judge, stripped of her flawless designer gowns and heavy diamond necklaces. She wore a standard drab prison uniform, her hair limp and her face pale, completely drained of her trademark arrogance. When the judge handed down her sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and conspiracy, she did not scream or cry. She simply sagged forward, leaning heavily against the defense table, finally crushed by the massive weight of her own unchecked greed. Derek, due to his extensive history of offshore money laundering and his role as the primary architect of the financial shell companies, received a much harsher sentence of 10 solid years. They were led out of the courtroom through a side door, their wrists securely bound in heavy steel chains. I did not feel a single ounce of pity as I watched them disappear into the bleak, unforgiving shadow of the penal system. They had gambled with my family, and they had lost absolutely everything. My son Preston was living an entirely different kind of sentence. True to my word, I did not fire him. I kept him bound to the corporate structure of Stanford Developments, but I completely eradicated his life of unearned luxury. He was forced to sell his expensive sports cars, empty his retirement accounts, and liquidate every single asset he possessed just to begin paying back the massive restitution he owed to the company. Preston moved out of his sprawling suburban mansion and rented a cramped, dark studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Every morning he woke up before dawn, put on a cheap off-the-rack suit, and stood in the freezing rain to catch the public transit bus into the financial district. He arrived at the towering glass building he used to rule, bypassed the executive elevators, and rode the service lift down to the sub-basement. He spent 40 hours a week sitting in a windowless room under harsh fluorescent lights, manually entering historical financial data into our digital archives. I received weekly reports on his progress. The senior managers noted that he never complained, never asked for a single break, and never once mentioned his former title. He was a completely broken, humbled man, slowly grinding away the massive debt his foolishness had created. It was a severe, agonizing punishment, but it was also the very first time in his entire sheltered life that my son was actually earning his own way. With the toxic elements permanently removed from my life, I experienced a miraculous, undeniable resurgence. The heavy, suffocating fog of grief and perceived cognitive decline that had plagued me for months completely evaporated. I took absolute unyielding control of Stanford Developments. I arrived at the executive suite every single morning at exactly 6, fueled by a sharp, burning energy I had not felt in over 2 decades. My business instincts, which Victoria had so foolishly mistaken for senility, returned with devastating predatory precision. I personally negotiated 3 massive international acquisitions, expanding our corporate footprint across 2 new continents. I fired lazy contractors, restructured our supply chains, and drove our quarterly profit margins to historic, unprecedented highs. The board of directors, who had once looked at me with nervous pity, now watched me with profound, reverent awe. I was not just back. I was undeniably stronger, sharper, and far more dangerous than I had ever been before. But accumulating wealth was no longer my primary objective. The betrayal had taught me a deeply painful lesson about the true nature of legacy. Catherine had never cared about the billions in our bank accounts. She cared about people. She cared about building communities, offering shelter, and providing warmth to those who had absolutely nothing. I decided to honor her memory in the only way that truly mattered. I directed a massive portion of our newly recovered capital into a groundbreaking philanthropic initiative. We purchased vast tracts of neglected, dilapidated land in the poorest districts of the city. I employed the finest architects and urban planners to design beautiful, sustainable, and entirely affordable housing complexes. We called it the Catherine Stanford Foundation. It was not a cheap, superficial charity designed for a tax write-off. It was a monumental, permanent commitment to rebuilding the broken communities of Boston. Every single brick laid, every community center opened, and every family housed was a direct, beautiful tribute to the woman who had shared my life. As I stood on the construction site of the very first housing complex, watching the steel beams rise into the bright blue sky, I felt her spirit standing quietly beside me. The empire was not just reborn. It was finally serving a righteous, noble purpose. 6 months of relentless work, legal battles, and corporate restructuring had completely insulated my mind from the lingering pain of the past. I had systematically compartmentalized every single emotion, transforming my betrayal into pure, productive fuel. But there was still one massive, unresolved emotional debt I had intentionally avoided. One location I simply could not bring myself to visit while the war was still actively raging. Now, with the company thriving, my son facing his consequences, and my enemies locked away in concrete cells, the heavy armor around my heart finally began to soften. It was late Friday afternoon when I left the downtown executive tower. I dismissed my private driver, choosing to take the keys to my personal sedan instead. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the bustling city streets. I drove in complete silence, leaving the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district far behind me. The heavy traffic eventually thinned out, replaced by winding tree-lined roads that led toward the quiet, peaceful outskirts of the city. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as the familiar wrought iron gates of the Memorial Park came into view. I turned the vehicle onto the narrow gravel path, the tires crunching softly in the absolute stillness of the immaculate grounds. I parked the car near a sprawling ancient oak tree and turned off the engine. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring out through the windshield. I had won the war. I had saved our empire. But I had not spoken to her since the day I discovered the truth. I finally went to her. The late afternoon breeze swept through the ancient branches of the massive oak tree, rustling the dry autumn leaves in a soft, welcoming, and familiar melody. I walked slowly across the perfectly manicured grass, my expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the cool, damp earth with every single deliberate step. The Memorial Park was completely deserted, offering the profound, unbroken silence I had desperately needed for so many months. I stopped in front of the polished marble headstone. Her name was etched deep into the beautiful stone, Catherine Elizabeth Stanford, forever frozen in time, forever insulated from the ugly, treacherous greed that had temporarily infected our home. I reached into the pocket of my dark tailored coat and retrieved 2 delicate crystal glasses, along with a small, sealed bottle of her absolute favorite vintage red wine. I carefully uncorked the bottle, the rich, familiar aroma instantly filling the crisp evening air, pulling a flood of beautiful memories to the forefront of my mind. I poured a modest amount into each glass. I placed one gently on the cool marble base of her headstone and kept the other firmly in my right hand. I looked at her name, feeling a warm, gentle peace settle deep into my chest. I kept my promise, Catherine, I whispered, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet park. The empire we built together is completely safe. The parasites who tried to infect our legacy have been permanently removed. Victoria is locked away in a high-security facility where she can never manipulate or deceive another innocent, trusting soul. Derek is rotting in a bleak federal cell, entirely stripped of his arrogant delusions of grandeur. And Preston? My voice caught for a brief fraction of a second, but I quickly steadied it. Preston is finally learning the brutal, necessary lesson of consequence. He is working for his survival, completely stripped of his arrogance. He is no longer a liability. He is simply an employee paying a massive debt. I took a slow, carefully measured sip of the dark red wine, instantly savoring the rich, complex, and familiar flavors she had always loved so very much. I looked around the sprawling, peaceful cemetery. I also took care of the boy, I continued softly. I ensured little Leo will have a solid, well-funded education and a safe, comfortable roof over his head for his entire youth. I did it for you, Catherine. I know your heart would never allow a child to suffer for the sins of a treacherous mother. But he is entirely cut off from the Stanford wealth. Our life's work is funding the new philanthropic foundation. We are building homes for those who actually need them, just as you always wanted. Your beautiful heart is finally shaping the future of this city. I stood there in the fading twilight for a very long time, drinking the wine and sharing the quiet triumph of my absolute survival. I am exactly 70 years old today. I am standing entirely alone in the fading, dying light of a massive, empty, and beautifully tranquil cemetery. I have no wife waiting for me at home, and I have effectively severed my ties with my only son. The sprawling mansion I return to will echo with my solitary footsteps. But as I finished the last drop of wine and looked out over the rolling green hills, I felt an undeniable, monumental surge of quiet power. I had faced the ultimate betrayal from within my own walls, and I had completely, surgically eradicated it. I was no longer the grieving, vulnerable widower they had foolishly tried to conquer. I was the absolute, undisputed king of my grand domain, and my royal crown was completely, permanently secure. Never mistake a man's silence for weakness, and never mistake his profound grief for stupidity. When you build a massive empire with your own blood and sweat, you learn exactly how to protect it from absolute destruction. Greed inevitably blinds arrogant people to the brutal truth that those who create immense wealth always hold the ultimate power to destroy those who try to steal it. True family is bound by genuine respect and unwavering loyalty, not just a legally shared last name. Betrayal from within your own home is the deadliest poison a man can face, but cutting it out, no matter how excruciatingly painful it might be, is the only way to truly survive, rebuild, and completely heal your shattered soul. If you have ever had to make a ruthless, uncompromising decision to completely protect your peace and your hard-earned legacy from toxic family members, drop a comment below and share your personal story. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like to support more raw, unfiltered life stories.